Hello and welcome to the ISG Imagine Your Future podcast series. I'm Barry Matthews, I'm a partner at ISG, and I'm fascinated by technology. I've been working in technology consulting and leading technology consulting businesses for the past 20 years or so. In this podcast series, I discuss how technology is transforming business, and I get to interview some fascinating experts in technology. From leading CIO and CTOs to experts in emerging technologies or visionaries designing the future of work. I get to ask my guests the questions that interest me, and I ask them a little about themselves. That way we get to learn about some of the people who are pioneering technology's disruptive influence on business as we know it. From AI to blockchain through cyber and into sourcing and operating models. It's a lot of fun, and hopefully it's educational, inspirational, and entertaining. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoy it. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Imagine Your Future podcast, the podcast where we discuss the changing world of business and the impact that technology is having on the way businesses are run and, of course, on the way that we work. And today we're going to be discussing how the way we work is being transformed almost in real time at the moment, as over the past 4 months, as a result of COVID-19, our working lives have been radically changed. The vast majority of us having to work remotely, many for the first time in our lives, using new technology to manage conference calls and video calls, having to juggle working from home with homeschooling children and sharing a working environment with spouses. So everything has been turned upside down, and we really want to start thinking about that. Are we on the brink of meaningful, real change to the way we work, or will things go back to the way they were before COVID? And to help me to discuss that, I'm joined by two experts on the way we work and implications for the future of work. So Anna Cordrea-Rado, a journalist, podcaster, campaigner. She's written for the New York Times, for The Guardian, for the BBC, for Wired magazine, and many others. She also launched the Freelance newsletter in 2017, which is now a valued and trusted source of information for thousands of freelancers. So looking forward to meeting Anna and hearing about that. And also Phil Scone, who's leader of ISG's digital practice in Northern Europe, a trusted colleague of mine, a real expert in all things digital, particularly in the future workplace. So looking forward to an interesting, inspiring and entertaining conversation as always. So guys, I've done a pretty poor job of giving the basic facts about you both, but can I ask you to introduce yourself to our listeners? So Anna, maybe you could go first.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So yes, I'm Anna. I'm I'm a journalist by trade. That's the main thing that I do. And I write a lot about business, culture and technology, and with a particular focus on working life and all of the ways that work is changing, and all of the technologies around work and all of those things. I also I am a freelancer, and I run a community for freelancers, and as you mentioned, have my newsletter all about freelancing as well. And I also have a podcast called Is This Working?, which is all about the messy parts of work. And it's very interesting because I've been working in this space about work and the future of work for a while now, but I think it's become something that's super topical at the moment, given everything that's happening and the fact that we're very much living in a moment, a very historic moment where work is changing very drastically and very rapidly right in front of us. So there is a huge interest in it at the moment. And then I guess the last thing to say about me is that I'm currently working on a book called You're the Business, which is going to be out in 2021, which is all about freelancing, and it's basically a guidebook for freelancers and other people who work for themselves, because I think that we are seeing a big shift to freelancing. We've been seeing it happening over nearly the last decade, but there's been I think there will be a spike as a result of the pandemic as well. So that's me.
Excellent. Thank you. And welcome to the podcast. Really looking forward to talking a little bit about freelancing and the gig economy and gig economy platforms, and whether we really will see a spike now. I think we will, and a sort of rebalancing of the way work gets done, but we'll get into that later. And Phil Scone, can you introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Yes, of course. So, I, as you said, I lead the Northern Europe digital practice. As part of that, we look at, the operating model, so how we work in large organizations. I also chair ISG's Future Workplace Summit, which, as you might imagine, due to the events of this year, we took from an in-person event to an online event. As Anna says, the topic's having its day in the sun. Prior to ISG, I worked in a whole range of global enterprises, primarily in financial services, so banks and insurers, running a global digital PMO and practice, supporting front-end customer experience.
Brilliant. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, and a very warm welcome to you as well. Okay, well, let's start by thinking about what has changed over the last 3 to 4 months, and we've sort of I briefly touched on it in the intro, but vast majority of the working population all suddenly had to cope with working remotely. And Phil and I work with large-scale technology service providers with hundreds of thousands of employees, and they all had to suddenly prepare their people to move away from shared working environments, shared service centres and large-scale outsourcing centres to working from home. They had to get laptops and sometimes even desktops physically moved to their employees' homes, and they had to do that while maintaining service levels for their clients. And as I said, sometimes sharing the kitchen table they were working around with their other halves, and maybe their kids who are having to be homeschooled, sometimes in really cramped apartments. And it must have put an awful lot of pressure on some people and been an incredibly difficult time for many. What do you think I suppose the challenges have been, and also the benefits, and what have you guys seen? Maybe Anna, you could kick us off. What have been some of the good things and the more challenging things which have come out of this new way of working over the last 3 to 4 months?
I think, I'll start with the benefits and the sort of the upside. As someone who's been working from home for over 3 years now, granted in a freelance capacity, but nonetheless, obviously the mechanics of working from home is pretty much the same thing, and who absolutely loves working from home, I've really been very glad to see that more people have been introduced to the benefits of home working, because I do feel that the flexibility that you have when you're at home to set your own schedule and also be able to make more time to do the things that might benefit your well-being. So, for example, the time you save on a commute in the mornings and in the evenings, you can repurpose that for either exercising or having time to actually cook a nice home-cooked meal, or spending time with your family, or whatever it might be. And all of these things, obviously, within the parameters of the quarantine and kind of lockdown rules, but nonetheless, it is possible. And also, I think for a lot of people, also the office was quite an unproductive place. And actually that, especially if you do any kind of work that requires quite a lot of thinking, or, in my case, I spend a lot of my time writing, and I used to find it almost impossible to get any significant writing done in an office. Yeah. So I really kind of enjoy that aspect of working from home. And I think that people are seeing the benefit. One thing I will also say, and I think people have kind of grasped this by this point, but I think it's really important to kind of, to emphasize that, and even still now, as we are easing out of lockdown, nonetheless, we are still very much in the middle of a global pandemic. And It's not so much that we're all working from home, it's that we're working in the middle of a pandemic. So there is that kind of distinction. And actually, right at the beginning of lockdown, when the shift to working from home first came into place, I was actually a bit worried that people would have a really negative view of working from home, because they would find it quite challenging, because you are having to work from home when everyone else is working from home. So there wasn't really time to plan and to set the systems up in place that you need to work as best you can while your team is in different places and all of that kind of stuff. Not to mention, as you said, having to share your space with family, partners, housemates, whoever it might be. I think as for the downside, I think that again, a lot of the downsides we are seeing are because of the pandemic rather than so much working from the actual kind of mechanics of working from home. Because I think that for a lot of people, they might take the decision to work from home, but they wouldn't take that decision if all of their other housemates or their family members were also in their house at the same time. So things like having to negotiate your space and also having to actually, finding somewhere to actually work. So a lot of people, they'll pick their homes without having thought that they would need to work from them. To work effectively, when your team is remote and in different places, you need this, it's not just the technology, it's how you use the technology. It's what systems you have in place to make people feel comfortable working from home, to make people sort of feel like they don't have to be responding to Slack messages all the time. And it's putting those systems in place. And I think because this shift was very much overnight, we're still companies are still trying to iron out these kinks and just make that transition a bit smoother. Yeah,
it's really interesting. I was talking to a friend who was saying he'd read some study somewhere which said a worker's satisfaction is not about recognition. It wasn't just about salary, but it was so much about the commute. Their daily commute had such a negative impact on the way or what they felt about their work, that removing that has had such a positive impact on so many people. But I think what's also really interesting is, as you say, when you've got time to plan working remotely or working from home, and you can design your space, you can design an office in the garden or whatever it might be, like a garden room, which I know the demand for garden offices has gone through the roof during the pandemic. But suddenly it was forced upon all of us, and we all just suddenly had to make do. And I think it's that's caused quite a lot of stress for people over the last few months. So, yes, it's really an interesting area. Phil, what are your thoughts on pros and cons?
Well, I'm with Anna actually. So I ran a remote global team for up to 8 years prior to coming to ISG, and so certainly working from home, different time zones and working patterns are very familiar to me. And what I've noticed is, a lot of the tools that the team and I used during that period are really coming to the fore now. There's a lot of stakeholders that we talk to in clients where, they might have been really offish about the idea of, if I can't see you in the office, I don't really believe you're working properly, who've been disabused of that in very short order as their whole organization has had to go remote. So I think what's happened there is a cocktail of a few things at the same time. In terms of positives, we've seen, some great stories coming out from the clients and large organizations about what they've been able to achieve in terms of enabling that remote working, whether it's, using automation to fire out and automatically order and set up VPNs, or whether it's using, cloud services to do that. A lot of people have, jumped into the challenge and been able to achieve some great things to enable their workforce, to the point where, in many cases, decision makers in the organization were like, well, if I'd asked you to quote for that, you'd have told me it had taken 6 months or a year. What else can we do if we choose to act? So I think people have lent into that. In terms of some of the stories coming out about leaders, what it has done is given people a more candid, authentic view of their leaders in some instances. If everybody's working from the kitchen table or the home office, I think a lot of those leadership messages have been less curated. And what people have found is they've really valued those interactions and would like to keep that. And they're worried that might go away, once people return to the office in larger numbers. I think in terms of some of the other challenges, we talked a bit about what I would call digital presenteeism. People have found it difficult to compartmentalize their working day because everybody knows that they're largely at home. They're a lot more reachable, and it's very difficult to switch off. And I think the point earlier about having a dedicated working space, very important to mentally be able to go to somewhere else in your house and switch off. And overall, we're starting to see, those reports that burnout for employees is starting to become a bit of a concern as well.
Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say that's the other balance, isn't it? Because yes, you've got more time for exercise because you're not commuting, or you can be more flexible with the way you work. But unless you're disciplined about that, you've also got more access to your work. You are online the entire time. You can be, you can, if you let yourself, be working suddenly 16 hours a day if you've got deadlines to make. So I think there's good and bad, and achieving that balance is quite an art, I think.
It's a question of maturity. So, some of the practices around everybody jumping on a Zoom call and everybody, enjoying experimenting with video technology, we're starting to see that calm down and people choosing the right tool and the right format for the job. I think when it comes to, managing that work time, that will be a real test of organizations' maturity in terms of how to engage their employees about what's sustainable as a set of working practices and what might work going forward in terms of, the location and the context of the work they're going to do.
Yeah, I think there are some things you can do really well virtually, and as you said, it's forced us to be more creative in the way that we work, the way we communicate, the way we build community. And there are some things which lend themselves to working remotely, as Anna said. If you need really focused time to write, I can imagine it's really good to avoid some of the distractions that you might get in the office. And there are some other things like selling, doing business development activities that have been much harder to do remotely, because they often rely on generating that sort of relationship, that looking somebody in the eyes, having that sort of physical trust, which is often much easier to build when you're physically with someone than working remotely. And I think anybody involved in sales has found that challenging. So it sort of depends what role you are doing, doesn't it? Whether it's been a real benefit or a challenge, I think. It's been an interesting thing, I think, Phil, when I think back, we didn't use video conferencing really until the pandemic hit. We used it occasionally, but it certainly wasn't the norm. We would have conference calls, we wouldn't all be on video, and then suddenly we all went to video because we decided that we should, because we wouldn't physically see each other otherwise. And you suddenly get a glimpse into everybody's homes, which is quite interesting, right? It was one of those things. It's a really human thing, I think. But when there's 20 of us on a call and you're looking at someone's office or their house, or you can see when someone's moved from their office downstairs to their kitchen or what have you, it's almost been a talking point. I think it's been quite a nice human touch. And then the other thing that we've certainly done at ISG has been very creative about having quizzes, having baking competitions. We had a ISG's Got Talent on video the other day with somebody breathing fire, Phil Scone, which was a hidden talent that you didn't think I'd talk about. Somebody on a unicycle, somebody doing something else. We've had to be very creative about the way you try to create community. And I think that's been one of the good spin-offs, actually, that we've had to think quite hard about how we create culture.
I think one of the things that's coming, though, is when we return to that sort of longer term working patterns, there's a really important conversation. And Anna, I'll be interested in your thoughts about this. An important conversation about how you integrate people working remotely with the office. So I was talking with a client recently about the need to make sure that whoever's working remotely isn't a disembodied voice on a turret phone. And that we find better ways to integrate them into meetings. I mean, how have you seen people manage that, Anna?
Any place that I've worked in where remote working was an option, yes, you definitely very much have that. It's not even a stereotype; it is a reality of the speakerphone where the person just can't quite hear what's going on in the meeting. I think that we're still very much in a phase of figuring out how we're going to, what the future of the office looks like. And I do think, because this is the other thing about working from home and remote working, is that right now it has been working well because everyone has been doing it. And the challenge is when you have half the team or a portion of the team working in the office and another portion working from home. And I think really the conversation is about, what is the office going to look like post-COVID? Will there even be a place where people will go and sit at desks and be expected to be there between core hours? Or will it be a case that, okay, well, some teams, for example, sales, they really do want and need to be in the office. So that team will be in the office, whereas other teams, actually their core hours will be expected to be done at home. And almost you see a split between the focus work, which gets done at home, and the collaborative work, which gets done in the office. And the office becomes more of a hub and a place where you come very intentionally, and you have specific meetings that can't really be done remotely. Or it becomes kind of a place for the sort of the cultural side of the office as well, for this kind of social interactions and that kind of thing. And I think there needs to be a really big conversation and a big sort of think about what do we want our offices to look like going forward. Not least because for a lot of people also, they are going to want to stay working at home, either for flexibility reasons, or for many people, they just might not feel safe going into an office. There might be people who continue to be vulnerable and at risk because until a vaccine comes, we are still going to be living with this virus. So I think that there's also a question of safety and how do we make sure offices are safe. And the reality is that the fewer people are going into offices, the safer that will be. So I think this really needs to be a reimagining of what the office looks like, and maybe kind of downsizing from big spaces where there's open plan desks to, like I said, these kind of hubs where we come together for collaboration and culture building, rather than attempting to do any focus work, which gets done at home.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, isn't it? Because I think you're right. I think organizations are going to have a big rethink, and indeed they already are, especially the large ones who employ hundreds of thousands of employees. You think of the cost benefit to them of not having the physical office space that they've had previously, and they're realizing now, and they're quite surprised that actually they've managed pretty well during lockdown. Productivity has not decreased. In some cases, it's increased, and their employee satisfaction has increased as well. So thinking, well, why should we go back to the way it was before? And I really do think it's going to start to have a real, or there's going to be real implications to the office life of the future, or the standard working or way of working that we've had in the past. And Anna just raised something really important, Phil, that I'd like to get your take on. So if you think if the solution might be some sort of halfway house, if you like, more sort of hot desking, an office environment that you can go into when you want to, but that you don't need to go to full time, depending on your role. And it was sort of hot desk environment. Certainly, while there is still a risk to health, there will be implications from people going to a shared desk environment. The implications where somebody may appear to be ill or be ill. I mean, how do you handle that in the future working environment? Do you need some sort of citizen passport? Is it track and trace type scenario? What do you think organizations will put in place to counteract these risks?
Well, you're right that it's really important. It's on organizations' minds. And if you remember, we ran some of those surveys with firms that bore out the concerns there. Something like 80% plus were rightly concerned about health and safety in the office, and 2/3 were concerned about health and safety on the commute. So if you're going into the office, it's got to pass the make sense test for actually going in there to do the work. But once you are in there, then the way that the space is laid out has got to not only be, promoting health and safety, but actually still be workable. So I do think that in terms of the components of what you need to help people, things like location-based services and just tagging in and out, understanding who's in the office and why, will really help when it comes to, keeping on top of potential outbreaks, etc. But that does require a really serious conversation about use of data and what's acceptable or not, with employees. So something we're talking with firms about is really, re-engaging with the employee community and not assuming that everybody's going to come back wholesale. Really understanding what some of those new working patterns might be and what people's real concerns are about coming back, and then building solutions around that. So as a general rule of thumb, based on the stats that we've seen, we're challenging firms to say, what will your work routines look like if 40% plus of people are in a remote location of some sort, and that it's not the same 40% each day? So it might be like a rotating workforce coming through. What will that mean to what you're choosing to do in the office and what it's for? What would the purpose of coming in be? And when you do have people in the office, what does that do to the setup? So on a very, basic note, it might be that you're coming in and hot desking and the desks are a lot more spaced out. We still need to ask the question, why? If you brave a 1.5 hour commute on the tube and then come and take your laptop out and go on a video call, did it really make sense for you to come in? Or if you're now coming into a collaboration space because you've got to meet with 2 or 3 others and do, brainstorming on a whiteboard or equivalent, then how does that space need to be set up? It's now going to be really important that the firm you're working for knows who is where and is able to sort of, use that data to make sure that they're protected. Perhaps that's capacity planning for a building. Yeah. Perhaps that's smart scheduling to make sure that particular floors or office areas aren't oversubscribed. Perhaps it'll be a booking system so that you can say, it's not a hot desk, I'm going to be on that desk tomorrow. And, can we make sure that it's available for me? So it's really evolving our ability to support the workforce and wrap data around that process to make it meaningful.
Yeah, interesting. I think it could raise all sorts of questions about liability. It's not just the sort of health and safety of old, but now there's all sorts of new implications about going to the office, potentially being exposed to risk, and then the implications on liability should that unfortunate circumstance arise. A whole minefield, I'm sure, of legal complexity of this as well, which will have an impact on what organizations do. What about technology? And maybe you can start with this one, Phil. We're starting to use more of Microsoft Teams. We're all doing Zoom calls. We're, using Slack and Yammer and these communication type tools. And we're finding that we can do more things than we thought we could, right? We're collaborating using whiteboards on them. We're doing all sorts of interactive things with clients that we didn't think we could. Is that just are we at the start? Do you think we'll see, virtual reality come into play? Will we see big developments in remote technology or remote technology that enables remote working going forward?
So short answer, yes. My take on it, having seen it, from a remote working environment across a globally distributed team, is once people have got used to, what do I use for my one-to-ones? Is it FaceTime or a quick mobile call? What do I use for team meetings? Is it a Zoom or a Blue Jeans or a Teams? What do I use for a larger scale event? Once you get into those working rhythms, you quite quickly get into really what are the systems underpinning that? How do I support asynchronous collaboration? So if I want to know what somebody's doing or what the latest is, do I really have to get on a video call with them? Or can we have, platforms available that tell me that and give me transparent dashboards? And there is a range of tools that you can use, whether it's simple sort of, agile post-it note type planning tools, or whether it's something more in depth, workflow and automation. There are a range of tools out there. But one of the trends that we're seeing is, for, especially for things like Teams, where Microsoft's got its arms around a whole ecosystem, is, Power Apps being built into those collaboration tools. And we're seeing the rise of things like the sort of, Power Apps Teams, where you're looking at what functionality is the workforce ready for in terms of taking on new working models and practices. How can you use that behavior to change some of the less efficient practices of the past? So as an example, rather than, Barry, you sending a 10 megabyte PowerPoint to 50 people and they all save a version of it to do their comments and then they all email it to each other and, suddenly you're paying for a lot of storage. Can we all collaborate on something that's on, the same place? Can we collaborate on that file live, see each other's changes? Yeah. And that can save on storage. So that's about the rise of change management in helping people get to grips with new technology, get the best out of it, and really get the value from it. I've previously experimented with a range of technologies. As you know, and we'll talk about it later, I'm a VR fan, but we've also used, some of the double robotic style wheeled drones, used remote control turrets with an iPad on that you put in the middle of a meeting to help make it feel like somebody's there. I think really, some of those experiments work, in their own narrow context. I think the most important thing is to engage in a conversation, as a working team about what tools will give you the value, and make sure you have a process for evaluating, what is usable and really helping productivity.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how these tools develop over time. I do think we will see an acceleration of some of these tools now for obvious reasons. And one of the reasons is I firmly believe we're going to see a real disruption in the type of workers we have within the workforce. And I think we're going to see a rise of the freelance or gig economy. And I think that because I really believe we're in a bit of a paradigm shift from a technology perspective. If technology's transformed how fast we get things done and what we produce and the skills we need, we're still in a situation, certainly from a technology perspective, where organizations are looking for skills and they're finding that they're in very short supply. So there's a scarcity of software development or data and analytics or AI or machine learning or quantum skills, and those companies looking to find those skills are looking in new places to find those skills, and quite often they're in the freelance world. According to the World Health Organization, half to 2/3 of organizations are likely to use external contractors to address these skill gaps, and at the same time vast swathes of the population are opting into the freelance workforce. 42 million Americans will opt into the freelance workforce in 2020. And if you think of the 8 million, I think it is, people furloughed just in the UK, these are highly skilled, well-educated, well-trained people who are now at home looking for work or have had some time off, furloughed, but able to work, able to use technology. So I think it's a natural step to think, maybe I'm out of work post-furlough, but I have the skills to work remotely. I understand how to use technology to work remotely. I can still be of significant value to organizations without going into the organization physically. So I'll use a freelance platform to work. And I think that will lead to a real change in dynamics and the type of workers we have in organizations. So Anna, what do you think to that? Do you think I'm right? Do you think we will see more higher demand for freelance workers now?
I think we will. I think we'll see a higher demand both on companies' ends, as in I think organizations will be looking to hire more flexible workers and take on contractors and freelancers, etc. And I think also there will be an interest in freelancing on the workers' end as well. So I think a lot of people will be going, at the moment, this whole experience and living through this pandemic has had pretty much all of us rethinking lots of different aspects of our lives. And I think for a lot of people, they have thought about, am I really in a job that I want to be in? Do I actually want to work like this? Would I rather be an independent worker? I know that in my industry, the media, it's in many ways you are actually more secure when you work for yourself than when you have a staff job. It's more of a case of when rather than if you get made redundant as a journalist, speaking as someone who was made redundant from a staff job. And so there are particular industries where in as kind of counterintuitive as it might sound, being freelance actually offers you a greater deal of security. And one thing I do want to also just quickly distinguish is the gig economy from the freelance economy, because gig workers are of course also self-employed, and both freelancers and gig workers are self-employed. But the difference really is that gig workers this is on-demand work. So Uber drivers, delivery drivers, they use platforms where the work is only available if the demand is there, and it's very much an on-demand service. Whereas freelancers like me, it's more project-based, and most of my work comes through me directly pitching for work or having some kind of relationship with an organization. And yes, right. Freelance platforms do exist, but they operate in a slightly different way. And actually, to that point, I think kind of the big thing that I'm really interested in is I really hope that because there will be more freelancers, we will hopefully reach the critical mass that we need to protect the rights of those freelancers. So one of the many hats I wear is a campaigner for freelance workers' rights, and particularly around pay issues. And a big problem we have, and we see this in discussions both about the freelance economy and the gig economy, is the rights around that these workers have. Do they have rights? And of course they should have rights, but because they don't work directly for an employer, it is a lot easier for these workers to be taken advantage of. The thing that we just need to make sure culturally moving forward is just that protections are in place for these workers.
Yeah. That's a really, really important point. And because I think if we do see a significant increase for the reasons you've said in the freelance economy using platforms, and it's an area that Phil and I know pretty well, because in the technology world, you see the top coders of the world, or the Brain Trust, which is a new one based on blockchain that Phil and I were discussing last week. With, as we see more of these platforms coming to the fore and becoming more popular, and they effectively link up supply and demand, supply from the freelance economy to demand from large-scale global organizations, protecting the workers' rights is going to be significantly important. And I've read quite a lot about it over COVID through the Uber drivers or Lyft drivers, etc., but not from an enterprise perspective. So I'm assuming this will become more mainstream as more organizations, large organizations, start to use the freelance economy much more than they have in the past. I'm going to change tack now slightly, because we've talked quite a lot about what the future of work is going to look like, how COVID has changed everything and disrupted things, and whether we will go back to this new normal. I hate that term, sorry, but go back to the way things were, or we'll do things differently. We've talked a bit about technology, about culture, what the future models might look like, how the freelance economy is likely to expand, and the rights of workers, etc. But I want to change tack now and ask you guys some of the more personal, if you like, questions that I ask all of my guests. If you've listened to the podcast before, you'll be familiar with these 5 questions. So I'll ask you both, and Anna, why don't you go first, and then Phil, you follow. And the first question is there a technology that's had a big influence on your career to date, or which technology has had the biggest influence on your career to date, and why?
So this was a real toss-up between what would seem like a very mundane piece of technology and something that a bit more jazzy. So I'll just answer. I will cheat and give both. The mundane one is a digital calendar, because my digital calendar very much is the core part of my whole project management and time management system. And I kind of almost see it as my air traffic control unit. Everything that has to get done is put as an appointment in my calendar. I have lots of different crazy colors and a very complicated system, but it's one that works really, really brilliantly for me. Yeah. And then in terms of so I guess that very much also really came into its own when I became freelance, because managing your time is a really, really core part of being successful as a freelancer. But then the slightly more exciting piece of technology that really has had an impact in the last 6 months to a year is a piece of transcribing software that transcribes in real time. So it records the conversations and then it transcribes. So it transcribes the conversation in real time. It's called Otter, and it's absolutely brilliant because one of the big pain points that journalists have is having to record their interviews and then having to spend longer than the duration of the interview transcribing them. And this piece of technology has really, it's one of those pieces of technology where I actually see very clearly the time that I am saving, and I can, so that's been I'd say that's been kind of very transformative more recent.
Yeah. How cool. And does it get words, how accurate is it, I suppose is my question.
It gets a lot more accurate the more you use it. And very interestingly, it was actually designed not for journalists, but it was actually designed for minute taking, for in-person meetings. But it's been very much co-opted by the journalist community. It does get a lot more accurate. It was originally developed in America, so it tends to understand American men most easily.
Okay.
But I use it so heavily that it knows my voice really well now. So, and it gets a lot more accurate, and it's all AI based. So obviously the more users it has and the more conversations it's recording, the smarter it becomes.
Oh, fantastic. That sounds like it could be a good answer for my third question as well on gadgets. But that's, that sounds like that was a great answer. Phil, same question for you. Is there a piece of technology that's had a big influence on your career?
Say a type of technology. So what they used to call back in the day rich internet applications, whether that's web or mobile. I was lucky enough to get into a digital leadership role just as, mobile was coming on the scene, and web applications are getting a lot more interactive, and a lot of firms didn't know what to do with that. So I was able to lead a capability that helped the bank that I was working for at the time explore that and show the art of the possible. And that's, propelled me into keeping in that domain ever since.
Interesting. I didn't know that. See, this is educational for me. I'm learning about my colleagues.
Yeah, you see.
So, Phil, let me stay with you then. Second question. Which technology has, in your experience, promised the most but delivered the least? Is there a bit of technology that's been a damp squib in your experience?
Well, yeah, and this answer will also come up, I suspect, in another answer in a moment. But I would say that VR, so virtual reality and augmented reality, they're fantastic technologies which are starting to get traction both, with consumers and in enterprises. But I don't think they've delivered even a sliver of the value that they could. So there's a lot further to go, and I'm excited for what it could do and impatient for the progress made to date.
Yep, I'm with you on that one. Good answer. Anna, same question for you.
Email. I think that, I know, of course, email has been hugely transformative for work and workplaces, but I think that especially the move to have email on your phone has done more harm than good overall. And also, I think the point we're at now, particularly with Gmail and Outlook kind of having such a big monopoly on email clients, these technologies have not really been innovated very much at all in the last few years. And there's so much more that I want my email to do. And I feel that on the whole, email causes me so much more stress than it actually does bring positive into my life, and creates more blockages and time wasting, particularly in a work context, than it does actually add anything.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. And I think even though we've got other communication tools that we could all use in enterprises, we still send damn emails. I've got kids who, my son's 21 and about to go into the workforce. They don't. He and his friends don't use email at all. Yet he's going to go into an office environment where still the main way of communicating will be via email, and he'll just find it alien. I think it's really time we moved on or improved things. So yeah, great answer. Let me ask you again, and a third question. Is there a gadget that you use a lot or that you get most pleasure from using as part of your daily life? Like I said, you may have given that answer already with Otter.
No, so I have an actual gadget, which is an alarm clock that it's one of these light alarm clocks that mimics the sun rising. And it's brilliant for two reasons. One, any alarm clock rather than a phone, I think, is a fantastic gadget for the modern worker to have, because it helps you. The reason I bought this alarm clock was because I didn't want to have my phone in my bedroom and to use that as my alarm. So I wanted an alarm clock. And the reason that I got this one that does all this fake sunrise thing, is because it's a much more pleasant experience than being jolted awake by an aggressive alarm clock. And then that in turn, I mean, there's so much science about the benefits of sleep. And if you really want to be productive, just sleep better and sleep more and wake up in a more pleasant way. And so this thing is truly, I think it's probably my favorite. I've had it now for, I don't know, nearly 5 years. And it's the best gadget I've ever bought.
Oh, what a great tip. I've seen them advertised and I'm never used one, but maybe I will now. It reminds me of I bought my wife I think it was last Christmas, something called a Barisia, which is it's basically like like an old fashioned teas made. But it's like a really cool coffee teas made, basically. So instead of the alarm going off, you set it so that it starts brewing the coffee. And you're awoken by the sort of noise of the bubbles going up through the pipe and into the filter, and it wakes you up with an amazing fresh, just one cup of coffee at one at a time. You set it so you get the smell and the noise of the coffee waking up, which if you like caffeine as much as my wife does is a good thing to wake up to. Phil, what about you?
So for me, back to the VR again. So I own like a room setup for VR. I think it's absolutely transformational technology. The first time I put on a VR headset, I just found myself saying, my God, they've finally done it. Any technology that completely fools your brain into thinking you're in a completely different reality is something that, I never thought I'd see. And it's an amazing experience. Unfortunately, you sound like an utter loon describing the experience to somebody else. It's something you can only really understand if you've tried it. But my prediction is the retirement home of the future will be VR enabled and will contain people's memories and photos.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. What a great idea. I've not tried that, and I must. Good answer. Penultimate question. Which technology do you believe will have the most disruptive influence on business over the next decade? So, Anna, let's go to you first.
Probably video conferencing. I know that obviously the technology is not new, but the moment we're in right now, we've seen its mass adoption, as we actually even discussed on this episode earlier. And I think that we will continue, I hope that companies will continue to innovate with these technologies and will move away from defaulting to Zoom when it should be a phone call and or other video conferencing software. And that video conferencing software will be used in much more interesting and collaborative ways and creative ways, because ultimately, I think video calling is kind of underpinning this ability to work remotely. And so I think that how we use this technology and the etiquette around it and things like combating Zoom fatigue and all of this kind of stuff, I think this will continue to be a major part of work going forward over the next few years.
Yeah, great answer. And I would never have thought of that before this pandemic, and now I can absolutely agree with you. I think it's going to have a huge impact on the way we work. Just seeing how it's transformed the way we communicate in ISG, but also seeing, in society. I bought my elderly mother an iPhone at the start of the pandemic so she could start to use FaceTime calls and video calls, and it honestly has made such a difference to her to be able to see us over WhatsApp or wherever, because she's on her own, and she's constantly telling me what a massive difference it's made to her, because she would have been very lonely, but now she's able to actually see people every time she phones them. Now she won't stop calling us now. So every time the phone goes, it's my mum on video call. So we've created a monster, but it makes such a difference. I think you're right. We're going to see huge progress in that technology over the next decade. Phil, what about you?
It's kind of related to the topic of the podcast, really. So I think ubiquitous access to fast internet, whether that's 5G, 6G, or whether it's Starlink or something like that, I think that's going to democratize what work can be done where. I think it will enable talent pools to be unlocked across a range of geographies, and that will be disruptive for how businesses source talent, but also the more that technology matures, the more it will enable. So it will enable the metaverse, which is where location-based services, AR, VR, data visualization, and communication all meet. It's like a virtual world mapped onto the real one.
Wow.
And that all gets enabled by, the right communications infrastructure being put in place, and it all being fast enough and cheap enough for anybody to access it.
Yeah, well, 5G will have or whatever, 6G, 7G by then will have a big impact on that. But no, good answer. Okay, final question. Let me come to you first, Phil. So is there somebody who's had a big influence on your career to date?
Absolutely. So Sir Clive Sinclair, he brought computers into the home. And, I was able to program when I was a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid on, really simple 1K memory, computers.
Yeah.
But it brought it into the home. And I remember creating little computer games and swapping it with my friends on a cassette. I'm dating myself terribly, but I think that's enormously impactful and obviously stayed with me ever since.
Wow, yeah, I remember the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 and the BBC Micro and all those. I think we're of a similar age. But no, good, great answer. And look, yeah, how it's helped you pursue a career in technology to the dizzy heights of the digital lead for Northern Europe for ISG.
There we go.
And Anna, same question to you.
It's Cal Newport, the computer science professor at Georgetown University. He's probably best known for his book, Deep Work. And that book has had a transformative effect on me and how I use technology. So he's a very critical thinker about technology and how we use it. And his big message is around making sure that we're very intentional in the way that we use technology and making sure that technology really adds to our lives. And I mean, deep work is really all about how to actually focus in a very distracted world and how to sort of use technology in a smarter way. And it's one of those rare books that I've read, and it's not just I've thought, oh yeah, these are really interesting ideas, but I've really applied them to my working day, and they very much become core parts of how I structure my day and kind of sort of how I operate. Yeah, he's got some other books out, about digital minimalism, and I think he's currently working on a book about email and stuff like that. But he's a really, really smart thinker about not just technology but also digital culture as well.
How interesting. And again, news to me, this podcast has been very educational for me today. So I will definitely be looking up deep work. That's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. As well as getting a new alarm clock, I think probably. So it's been very helpful for me. Guys, thank you ever so much for joining me today. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. I think we've really only scratched the surface of the future of work. It could easily be a long podcast series in its own right, and there's so many different areas we could go. But I think we're in no doubt that the world of work is changing before our eyes, as I said at the beginning. And we've all undergone this intense training course from working remotely, whether we're full-time employees, whether we're part of the freelance economy, whether we're on furlough, whatever it might be. We've all suddenly got used to working in a different way, and that's definitely going to continue. How it's going to progress is going to be a matter of real debate and interest, but it's definitely going to cause a big change to the way we interact our working, or the way we carry out our working lives and the way we interact.